This is a blood-stained manuscript, written in elegant Renaissance Italian script, sitting in the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale in Florence. Its pages contain 26 chapters that would reshape the very foundation of political power for the next 5 centuries. This is Il Principe, The Prince, penned by Niccolò Machiavelli in 1513, and it represents the most revolutionary manual of political strategy ever conceived. Within these pages lies the blueprint for how power truly operates, stripped of moral pretense and religious justification. The numbers alone reveal its staggering influence, translated into over 40 languages, cited by everyone from Napoleon Bonaparte to Henry Kissinger, and banned by the Catholic Church for nearly 200 years. Yet what remains hidden in plain sight is how Machiavelli's principles didn't just influence political thought. They became the invisible architecture of modern statecraft. Across 5 centuries, his strategies evolved from desperate survival tactics in warring Italian city-states to the sophisticated political machinery that shapes our world today. But how did a disgraced Florentine diplomat, writing in exile, create a system so effective that it would be adopted by kings, emperors, presidents, and prime ministers? What made his approach so dangerous that it fundamentally altered how political power is pursued and maintained? How did his enemies and critics ultimately become his unwitting disciples? And perhaps most critically, what can we learn from tracing the evolution of Machiavellian influence through history's most pivotal political moments? To understand Machiavelli's genius, we must first understand the man who witnessed the collapse of everything he believed in. Dr. Maurizio Veroli, professor of politics at Princeton University and author of Niccolò's Smile, has spent 3 decades studying Machiavelli's life and legacy. His research has uncovered how Machiavelli's revolutionary insights emerged not from abstract philosophy, but from brutal first-hand experience with political failure and survival. Niccolò Machiavelli was born into a world where political power balanced on a knife's edge. Florence in 1469 was a republic in name only, dominated by the Medici banking family, surrounded by hostile city-states, and constantly threatened by French and Spanish invasions. As a young man, Machiavelli witnessed the rise and fall of Savonarola's theocratic republic, the return of the Medici, and their subsequent exile. When the republic was restored in 1498, 29-year-old Machiavelli was appointed to the Second Chancery, making him effectively Florence's foreign minister. For 14 years, he traveled across Europe, negotiating with kings and generals, observing the mechanics of power firsthand. He watched Cesare Borgia construct and lose an entire state through calculated brutality and strategic miscalculation. He witnessed France's Louis XII fail to maintain his Italian conquests, despite superior military force. He saw Pope Julius II use spiritual authority to wage temporal wars. Most importantly, he observed how traditional medieval notions of honor, chivalry, and divine right repeatedly crumbled before practical necessities of survival and expansion. When the Medici returned to power in 1512, Machiavelli was dismissed, briefly imprisoned, and retired to his small farm in Sant'Andrea in Percussina. It was here, in political exile, that he began writing his observations into a systematic analysis of how political power actually operates. The Italy he knew was fragmenting under foreign invasion, but from this chaos, he distilled universal principles that would prove applicable across cultures and centuries. This is one of the earliest known examples of Machiavellian principles in action, though Machiavelli himself played only a secondary role. In 1502, in the fortress city of Senigallia, 27-year-old Cesare Borgia orchestrated what would become a textbook demonstration of political ruthlessness disguised as reconciliation. Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, had spent 2 years conquering the Romagna region through a combination of papal resources, French military support, and strategic alliances with local condottieri, mercenary captains who controlled their own armies. By December 1502, several of these condottieri had grown suspicious of Borgia's ambitions and formed a conspiracy against him. The rebels included Vitellozzo Vitelli, Oliverato de Fermo, Duke Paolo Orsini, and Francesco Orsini, seasoned military commanders who controlled significant territories and forces. Rather than face them in open warfare, Borgia chose a different approach entirely. On December 26, 1502, Borgia sent word to the conspirators that he wished to reconcile and invited them to meet him at Senigallia to discuss terms. The location was carefully chosen, a fortress town that Borgia had recently acquired, allowing him to control access and escape routes. Machiavelli, then serving as Florence's envoy to Borgia's court, was present to observe these events unfold. The conspirators arrived with minimal guards, believing they were attending peace negotiations under implied safe conduct. Borgia received them warmly, embracing each man and inviting them to dine. As evening fell, he suggested they inspect the fortress together. Once inside the fortress walls, Borgia's guards quietly surrounded the visitors. At a predetermined signal, the condottieri were arrested simultaneously. Within hours, Vitellozzo Vitelli and Oliverotto da Fermo were strangled by Borgia's personal executioner, Don Micheletto. The Orsini brothers were held prisoner, with Paolo dying under suspicious circumstances weeks later. Borgia had eliminated his primary enemies without a battle, without breaking any explicit promises, and without creating martyrs who might inspire further resistance. Machiavelli was mesmerized by the operation's efficiency. In his dispatches to Florence, he noted how Borgia had used the conspirators' own expectations against them. Their assumption that political enemies could negotiate in good faith became the instrument of their destruction. The incident taught Machiavelli that in politics, as in warfare, deception could be more powerful than force, and that moral conventions often served as vulnerabilities that ruthless opponents could exploit. Decades later, in 1519, in the imperial court of Brussels, a young Charles V was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, inheriting an empire that stretched from Spain to Austria to the Netherlands. At 19, he controlled more territory than any European ruler since Charlemagne, but he also faced threats from French expansion, Ottoman invasion, and Protestant Reformation. His advisors, educated in humanist traditions, initially counseled him to rule through Christian virtue and noble example. The results were disastrous. The French repeatedly invaded Charles's Italian territories, Martin Luther's rebellion spread across Germany, and Ottoman forces advanced deep into Hungary. Traditional approaches to imperial governance, relying on feudal loyalty, papal authority, and dynastic legitimacy, proved inadequate against determined opponents who recognized no such constraints. By 1525, Charles's approach had fundamentally shifted. His victory over Francis I of France at the Battle of Pavia demonstrated new principles at work. Rather than accepting the French king's surrender with traditional chivalric honor, Charles held Francis prisoner for over a year, forcing him to sign the Treaty of Madrid that ceded significant territory and required France to pay enormous ransoms. When Francis later repudiated the treaty, claiming it was signed under duress, Charles used this betrayal to justify even harsher measures in subsequent conflicts. Charles's treatment of the sack of Rome in 1527 revealed how thoroughly he had absorbed Machiavellian lessons. When his largely German mercenary army, unpaid and undisciplined, devastated the Eternal City and held Pope Clement VII prisoner, Charles publicly expressed regret while privately using the Pope's captivity to extract favorable terms for his ongoing disputes with France and England. He had learned to separate public moral posturing from private strategic calculation. Most significantly, Charles pioneered the use of what would later be called bureaucratic Machiavellianism, embedding Machiavellian principles within administrative structures rather than relying solely on personal charisma or dramatic gestures. His Spanish administrators in the Netherlands systematically eliminated traditional privileges and local autonomies, replacing them with centralized control mechanisms that could be operated by loyal bureaucrats rather than potentially rebellious nobles. The transformation was evident in Charles's correspondence with his brother Ferdinand, published centuries later in the Habsburg archives. Early letters show Charles agonizing over moral implications of harsh policies. Later correspondence treats such measures as routine administrative decisions. Machiavelli's insights had evolved from personal strategy to institutional practice. By 1740, Frederick the Great of Prussia had become something entirely different from medieval conceptions of kingship. Where earlier monarchs justified their actions through divine right or feudal obligation, Frederick explicitly embraced what he called reason of state, the principle that political necessity transcended conventional morality. His court philosopher Voltaire noted that Frederick kept a French translation of The Prince on his desk and consulted it regularly during political crises. Frederick's invasion of Silesia in 1740 demonstrated Machiavellian principles operating at unprecedented scale and sophistication. The Austrian succession crisis provided Frederick with an opportunity to seize the wealthy province of Silesia from the young Empress Maria Theresa. Rather than fabricating elaborate legal justifications, as previous rulers might have done, Frederick simply announced that Prussia needed Silesia's resources and population and therefore would take them. The campaign that followed showcased military Machiavellianism refined to an art form. Frederick coordinated his invasion with French attacks on Austrian territories in the west, ensuring that Maria Theresa could not concentrate her forces against Prussia. He simultaneously negotiated with potential allies and enemies, making contradictory promises to different parties while maintaining that such duplicity was simply rational statecraft. Most remarkably, Frederick institutionalized Machiavellian analysis within his military and diplomatic apparatus. He established what amounted to the first modern intelligence service, with agents throughout European courts systematically gathering information about potential threats and opportunities. His military staff developed detailed contingency plans for wars against every neighboring power. Treating conflict as an inevitable extension of political competition rather than a regrettable exception to normal diplomatic relations. Frederick's correspondence with Voltaire, preserved in the Berlin State Library, reveals a ruler who had moved beyond Machiavelli's original formulations to create systematic approaches to power politics. Where Machiavelli wrote for individual princes facing specific crises, Frederick developed institutional mechanisms that could operate independently of any single ruler's personality or capabilities. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, provided the ultimate test of Frederick's system. Facing a coalition that included Austria, Russia, France, and Sweden, virtually all of Europe's major powers, Prussia survived through a combination of military innovation, diplomatic manipulation, and strategic persistence that demonstrated how thoroughly Machiavellian principles had been integrated into state machinery. Frederick's survival became a template for later leaders facing existential threats. The most remarkable example was discovered in the private papers of Otto von Bismarck, found in the Friedrichsruh archives after World War I. These documents revealed how the architect of German unification had developed Machiavellian statecraft into something approaching scientific precision. Bismarck, who served as Prussian minister-president from 1862 to 1890, transformed Machiavelli's insights about individual leadership into comprehensive strategies for national transformation. The crisis that elevated Bismarck to power perfectly illustrated the evolution of Machiavellian thinking. In 1862, the Prussian parliament refused to approve military reforms proposed by King Wilhelm I, creating a constitutional deadlock that threatened to paralyze the state. Previous rulers might have either capitulated to parliamentary demands or attempted to rule by force. Bismarck chose a third option that Machiavelli would have recognized immediately. He ruled without parliamentary approval, while systematically creating conditions that would eventually force the parliament to legitimize his actions retroactively. The Danish War of 1864 provided Bismarck's first opportunity to demonstrate this approach. Rather than simply defending German interests in Schleswig-Holstein, Bismarck maneuvered Austria into joint action, knowing that success would create new tensions between the two German powers. When Prussia and Austria jointly defeated Denmark, Bismarck ensured that the subsequent territorial arrangements would inevitably lead to Austro-Prussian conflict. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866 showcased Bismarck's most sophisticated application of Machiavellian principles. He simultaneously negotiated an alliance with Italy to ensure Austrian forces would be divided, secured French neutrality through vague promises about territorial compensation, and isolated Austria diplomatically while maintaining the pretense that Prussia sought only defensive measures. When Prussian forces achieved decisive victory at the Battle of Königgrätz, Bismarck prevented his king from demanding harsh terms that might create permanent Austrian enmity, calculating that future German unification would require Austrian acquiescence, if not active cooperation. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71 represented the culmination of Bismarck's system. Using the Ems dispatch crisis, Bismarck manipulated both French pride and German nationalism to create a war that would appear to be French aggression against German unity. His editing of Wilhelm I's telegram describing his meeting with the French ambassador transformed a routine diplomatic exchange into an apparent insult that made war virtually inevitable, while ensuring that France would bear responsibility for initiating hostilities. The resulting conflict unified Germany under Prussian leadership and established the German Empire as Europe's dominant continental power. Bismarck had achieved what no previous German leader had accomplished: the creation of a unified German state, without triggering the kind of European coalition that had historically prevented German consolidation. Most significantly, Bismarck's private papers revealed how he had systematized Machiavellian analysis into what he called the art of the possible. His detailed memoranda show a leader who treated political outcomes as products of calculable forces rather than accidents of personality or fortune. He developed sophisticated techniques for analyzing the domestic political constraints facing foreign leaders, enabling him to predict and manipulate their responses to his initiatives. Throughout European history, we observe a consistent pattern. External pressures drove the evolution of increasingly sophisticated applications of Machiavellian principles. The Italian city-states that formed Machiavelli's original laboratory faced invasion, internal rebellion, and economic competition that demanded innovative approaches to survival. Later European monarchs confronted similar challenges on larger scales, forcing them to develop more systematic applications of strategic deception, calculated risk-taking, and institutional manipulation. Successful practitioners consistently demonstrated certain characteristics. They separated public moral rhetoric from private strategic calculation. They anticipated and planned for opposition responses rather than hoping for compliance. And they embedded their approaches within institutional structures that could outlast individual leadership. The most effective Machiavellian leaders learned to make their methods appear inevitable rather than chosen, transforming strategic decisions into apparent responses to external necessities. What made these historical examples particularly significant was their cumulative effect on European political culture. Each successful application of Machiavellian principles created precedents that subsequent leaders felt compelled to match or exceed. Moral constraints that had once limited political action gradually eroded as leaders discovered that opponents who ignored such constraints gained systematic advantages over those who observed them. The transformation from Machiavelli's original insights to modern political practice demonstrates how ideas evolve through historical application. Contemporary democratic leaders routinely employ sophisticated versions of techniques that Machiavelli first observed in Renaissance Italy: strategic ambiguity in policy statements, calculated leaks to shape public opinion, alliance building based on shared interests rather than shared values, and the systematic use of institutional procedures to achieve substantive political goals. Modern political consultants, campaign managers, and policy advisors operate within frameworks that would be immediately recognizable to Machiavelli, even though contemporary democratic contexts require more subtle and indirect applications of his principles. The fundamental insight remains unchanged. Political effectiveness requires understanding how power actually operates rather than how it should operate, according to moral or legal theories. Yet historians continue uncovering evidence that Machiavellian influence extends far beyond what previous scholarship recognized. Recent archival research has revealed how many seemingly independent political innovations actually represented conscious applications of Machiavellian analysis. The ongoing digitization of historical correspondence and government documents promises to reveal additional examples of leaders who privately studied and applied Machiavellian principles while publicly maintaining conventional moral rhetoric. Perhaps most intriguingly, contemporary neuroscience and psychology research increasingly validates Machiavelli's observations about human political behavior, suggesting that his insights reflected deeper truths about social cognition and group dynamics that transcend specific historical contexts. Understanding Machiavelli's evolving influence may therefore provide crucial insights into persistent patterns of political behavior that continue shaping our world today.